Miller. Welcome back, everyone, for the first lecture of the season for the Sequoia Park Zoo's Conservation Lecture Series. This is our second time hosting a virtual series, so thanks for joining us tonight on Zoom and Facebook Live. I'm Dr. Ruth Mock, and I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at the Sequoia Park Zoo. And I chair the zoo's Conservation Advisory Committee, which oversees the zoo's conservation programs that were highlighted in the slideshow. We are very lucky to have Papa and Barkley sponsoring this lecture series again. They've supported this series for many years and have made the virtual series possible, and we would like to give them a big thank you. And before the lecture starts, let me go over how to interact with us during the lecture. First, as a disclaimer, we are recording this and it's being live streamed on Facebook. If your connection to Zoom is dropped and you're unable to reconnect, you can watch and comment over on Facebook. And if you're having trouble connecting to Zoom at all, it might be because you're not logged into your Zoom account. And we do require participants to be logged into a free Zoom account first before clicking the link to the lecture. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a chat button, and you can ask questions to the speaker by clicking on that chat button, which will pop up a chat box. And if you're watching on your phone, you may need to click 3 little dots that are at the bottom of your app, and then that gives you the option to open the chat. So we'll try to answer everyone's questions at the end of the lecture, and we'll also monitor the Facebook Live comment section, so feel free to post your questions as we're going in the chat here or on Facebook. And finally, during our in-person lectures, we always pass the hat around to collect donations for the zoo's conservation fund so that our zoo can continue to support conservation work across the globe. And this year, we're virtually passing the hat. We're going to be sharing a link in the chat to donate. And for those of you on Facebook, you can donate over at our website at sequoiaparkzoo.net. So thanks everyone for prioritizing conservation and joining us tonight for the lecture. I'm going to introduce Dr. Michaela Gunther, who is introducing tonight's speaker. So Dr. Gunther is a professor in the Department of Wildlife at Humboldt State University, whose research focuses on the behavioral ecology of mammals. And she has served on the zoo's Conservation Advisory Committee since its inception in 2011. And she organizes this lecture series every year for us, and we're so thankful for all of her efforts and her passion for conservation. So thanks, Michaela, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Ruth, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to all our community members for joining us tonight. I think our 11th annual seminar conservation lecture series. I'm so excited I've been able to be a part of it for this long. And I really value our community and especially the speakers who are willing to give their time and share their conservation story with our community. And I'm going to start with a just very small little background on the Friends of the Eel River that I pulled from their website. And it starts like this. In 1994, a small group of dedicated Eel River enthusiasts came together to advocate for the river and its fish. That was my favorite part of their intro. Friends of the Eel River works for the recovery of the wild and scenic Eel River, local to us, its fisheries and communities. And I'm so pleased that Alicia Heyman, who is here with us tonight, she has worked for Friends of the Eel River since 2013, serving as their executive director since 2019. She grew up in and spent her youth exploring the mountains, forests, and rivers of the Pacific Northwest, coming to Humboldt County in 2006. She earned her bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in business administration from Humboldt State University, and has spent her time in Humboldt learning about deep ecology, community organizing, and leadership. One thing that Alicia says she loves about this community is all of the grassroots movements and support for the local programs. And I think all of us here see that too. So we're very happy to have Alicia here. Thank you so much for joining us. She's going to be speaking up to us tonight about returning Eel River salmon and steelhead to the headwaters. Thanks so much, Alicia.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am really excited to be here. It seems like such a great opportunity to be the one to kick off the 2021 lecture series. I'm gonna just take this little awkward moment where I set everything up on my screen and start my presentation. Let's see. And there we go. Okay. So you guys already got the rundown on who I am. I'm Alicia Heyman. I'm the executive director for Friends of the Eel, and you got a little bit of the rundown on Friends of the Eel as well. As Michaela said, we were founded a little over 25 years ago by this small and really passionate group of activists. And, they had the ultimate goal of seeing the dams and the headwaters removed. And so the fact that we are nearing that objective now is just really exciting. It's, I feel just really honored to be a part of this work and to work for an organization that is doing such important things for such a very special watershed. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the Eel Watershed and what makes it special. And I guess before I dive into that, I would say also that Friends of the Eel engages in a lot of litigation and advocacy. We leverage scientific evidence and legal tools to do this work. And so that means we're the lucky ones who get to sue the bad actors who are causing damage to our natural wild places. And we get to do all that fun behind the scenes work that really results in strong environmental policies. So the Eel River is a really special place. Like I said, there's a super diverse landscape, and it stretches from, there's these vast stretches of really rugged wilderness. There's landscapes that shift from old growth redwoods to oak savannas. There's these massive boulder fields in the upper reaches of all the tributaries. It's the third largest watershed entirely in the state. It drains 3,600 square miles, and roughly 85, a little more than that, 85% or so is on private land. Most of the public land holdings are, hopefully you all can see my mouse here, in the upper reaches of the main stem in the Mendocino National Forest. And then there's some preserves farther down the main stem. You might have heard recently about the exciting acquisition that the Wildlands Conservancy has made on the right on the main stem in between the North Fork and the Middle Fork. The Lone Pine Ranch is what it's called. Just a really spectacular property with a lot of conservation value. And then there's a couple other small public land holdings on the South Fork and elsewhere, but really a lot of private land in the Eel. One thing that the eel is really well known for is the historic abundance of its fisheries. In the mid-1800s, this abundance led to the establishment of commercial fisheries that had canneries in the lower watershed. And so those canneries provided data that we can look to now that tells us about the historic populations of salmon and steelhead. Chinook populations historically reached up to like 800,000 fish, and steelhead and coho populations reached about 100,000 annually. So we're talking about 1 million fish coming into the eel back in the heyday. Today, unfortunately, those numbers are drastically reduced. We see a few thousand steelhead and chinook come into the watershed, and coho, unfortunately, are doing a lot worse, and they're anticipated to be extirpated from the system in the coming decades. This is partially due to the fact that coho prefer slightly colder waters, and so they're found on the more densely populated South Fork. That's the part of the watershed that most people are most familiar with because it runs adjacent to Highway 101. Coho are also more vulnerable to warming temperatures, which I think, as we all know by now, is something that we are in the midst of. So because Friends of the Eel is focused on recovering fisheries, we look to the root causes of this decline in fish population, and our main program areas reflect this. one of the best things that we can do for fisheries recovery in the eel is to remove the dams in the headwaters, which are known as the Potter Valley Project. So tonight I'm going to talk to you mostly about the Potter Valley Project, and if time allows, I'm also going to talk to you about the really awesome run of summer steelhead that we have in the Eel River. They're the southernmost fish, or I'm sorry, the southernmost run of these fish on the entire planet. And then if I've allowed for enough time, I'm also going to talk to you about this crazy coal train proposal that I'm sure many of you have heard of. So the Potter Valley Project. So one thing that is sometimes misunderstood about the eel is that it flows from the south up north. So when I talk about fish migrating upstream, I'm talking about them heading south or southeast. And when I talk about the headwaters of the river, that's actually way far south from here, down in Lake County down here. And that is where the Potter Valley Project is located. Some of you might be familiar with Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. It's located just off of Highway 20, a little east of Willits. So the Potter Valley Project consists of 2 dams, a mile-long diversion tunnel that goes through a mountain, and a powerhouse on the other side of that mountain that, well, my presentation says that today it generates roughly 5 megawatts, but actually that powerhouse is offline today because of an unprecedented failure of their main transformer bank, and I'll talk a little about that later. But for reference, the amount of electricity that's generated normally by this project is about enough to power a Walmart. And according to a 2015 study, it could be replaced with about 3 acres of solar panels. So as you're traveling upstream, like the fish do on their journey, the first dam you come to is Cape Horn Dam. It was completed in 1908. It stands about 100 feet tall, and it has a roughly 700 acre foot reservoir, which is quite small, and that's actually mostly filled with silt at this point. Cape Horn Dam does have a fish ladder, but it's really moderately effective, and in fact, it closes at peak migration flows due to the high velocity and getting really clogged up with debris, which I will also talk more about later. At Cape Horn Dam is where the mile-long diversion tunnel takes water from the eel and puts it into the Russian River. It's really quite a feat of engineering. It travels, like I said, a mile long through a mountain, and it sends roughly 65,000 acre feet every year into the east branch of the Russian. After generating like I said, a pretty measly amount of electricity, the water is then used by the community of Potter Valley primarily for irrigation, and then remaining water continues down the east branch of the Russian River all the way down here into Lake Mendocino. What's problematic about this diversion is the timing. Potter Valley doesn't store the water. They receive it when they need it most during the spring and summer, and that's when the eel can least afford the flows. But really, if we're talking about cumulative flows, it's not super problematic for the eel, and so there is a way that a continued diversion can be explored, which I will get into more details on. This powerhouse here, it's a real money loser. It's not only is the amount of electricity generated really insignificant, it also costs roughly $30 for every dollar generated. The infrastructure is very old. The tunnel, that incredible feat of engineering there, they have to shut it down every so often to do pretty significant repairs, like they were, I think it was in the spring of 2020 was the last time they had that closed down. And like I mentioned, the powerhouse itself right now is completely offline due to a failure of the main transformer bank. This is a really big deal, and it also impacts the amount of water that can be diverted to Potter Valley by the bypass channel that they're using around the powerhouse. One concern that Friends of the Eel, and I think many others have, is that PG&E might seek to or might be required to replace this infrastructure. They estimate that it could cost between $5 to $10 million and take at least a year and a half because there's parts that need to be custom ordered. So Friends of the Eel just a couple weeks ago wrote to the California Public Utilities Commission, alerting them to the transformer failure because they did not know about it. And we suggested that ratepayers should not be made to cover the cost of this unnecessary replacement of infrastructure, particularly because the license on the project is about to expire in April of next year. So continuing our overview of the project, as you continue going upstream about 12 miles, you come to Scottdam. Scottdam was completed in 1922. It stands about 140 feet tall, and it impounds the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir, which has a capacity of about 75,000 acre feet, although that also has quite a good amount of sediment in it. Some of the main problems with Scottdam are that it doesn't have any kind of fish passage. It leads to accumulation of methylated mercury, and it was built on a fault line, and so presents some pretty serious seismic and safety concerns, which I will cover shortly. And then I should say too that PG&E owns this whole facility, and they have since 1930, but they are no longer interested in owning this project, which presents a lot of liabilities for them. So why remove the dams? There are lots of reasons to remove the dams, and I'll start with what's most important to Friends of the Eel River, which is fish passage. As I mentioned before, the fish ladder at Cape Horn Dam is really inadequate and needs some pretty extensive upgrades. Friends of the Eel, in fact, asserts that it actually causes take of listed species, so we would prefer to see that entire dam removed along with Scottdam. Take, by the way, is a legal term. It means to harass, harm, capture, kill listed species. The definition's a little longer than that, but I think that'll suffice. Under the current license, PG&E has what's called an incidental take permit, and that basically means that they are allowed to harm or kill listed species under normal operation of their project. However, this permit expires in April, and Friends of the Eel has, of course, been preparing to litigate in the event that really swift action isn't taken to remove the fish passage barriers. This photo here shows part of the fish ladder infrastructure at Cape Horn Dam when it's clogged with debris during high flows. I mentioned before that one of the problematic things is that it is often closed. And so when it gets clogged up like this, PG&E has to turn the water off to the fish ladder, take it totally offline. They take several days, sometimes even weeks to clean it out. And it's really problematic because this is the time at which salmon and steelhead are trying to make a lot of progress on their migration journey. So if migrating fish, which includes iconic species like the Pacific lamprey, which are super, super cool fish. They're very ancient. They've got these great sucker mouths that allow them to suck onto surfaces and use that as a mode of transportation. So yeah, we've got Pacific lamprey, we've got summer and winter steelhead and Chinook salmon who all make it up to the dam. If they manage to make it past Cape Horn Dam, then they're abruptly stopped at Scottdam and prevented from reaching an additional several hundred miles of prime spawning habitat. Researchers have determined that there are at least 280 miles of steelhead spawning habitat. I think there's something like 80 miles of Chinook spawning habitat. So really a huge amount of quality habitat up behind the dams. One really exciting thing that we have learned, speaking of what's behind the dams, is that essentially the genetic code that makes a steelhead a summer run steelhead lives on in resident trout that are trapped behind Scottdam. I'll talk a little bit more about this genetic situation later, and I'll just apologize in advance to any geneticists or fisheries biologists in the audience because I'm going to oversimplify it a little bit. But Northern California summer steelhead, they were just listed as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act, and preserving their life history is a really critical part of protecting biodiversity and giving salmonids the resilience to adapt to things like climate change. So removing Scottdam presents a really huge opportunity for these native fish. There are many other reasons why it is inevitable that Scottdam will be removed. These include concerns about safety and reliability, the cost of regular operations, as well as the necessary upgrades, and quite a few other ecosystem impacts. So let's start with why they're unsafe. Friends of the Eel has been drawing attention to issues with dam safety and reliability for many years now. Several years ago, we commissioned a study by an engineering firm called Miller Pacific, who concluded that there were significant geologic hazards to Scottdam, including an active landslide just behind the dam on the south side. Scottdam also sits within a pretty concerning proximity to Bartlett Springs Fault Complex. You can see the fault line here, and we'll get a little zoomed in version. It runs right through the reservoir, and Scottdam sits right here, right adjacent to it. This fault complex is capable of generating significant earthquakes with up to a magnitude 7. And it's a side note, it's actually not that unusual for dams to be constructed directly on or adjacent to faults. It's the point at which a river channel is naturally quite narrow because of the way that plate tectonics are shifting. And so back in the 20th century, these narrow spots actually seemed kind of logical locations for dams. Another dam safety concern at Scottdam is the unstable foundation. Just behind the right or southern side of the dam, there is a huge and slowly shifting boulder, which the original construction team gave the unnerving name, the Knocker. I hate to imagine what they thought it was going to do to the dam. You'll notice if you ever visit Scottdam or in photos or construction graphics like this one, that instead of going straight across the river, there's this pretty severe bend in the dam right here. And that's because during construction, engineers began anchoring the south side of the dam to what they thought was bedrock, but it later slipped and they discovered that it was actually this huge boulder. So they re-engineered things a little bit and decided to just build the dam to go right in front of that bad boy. I should mention too that Scottdam is rated as a high hazard facility, which means that loss of life is likely in the event of dam failure. So it's actually pretty concerning stuff. The safety issues at Scottdam also make it an unreliable structure and unreliable as a water supply source. There are additional factors that also make it unreliable, and one of those is the sediment accumulating behind the dam and along the channels in the reservoir. The Eel has the highest suspended sediment load per drainage area of any river of its size in the US. That is to say, there's a lot of sediment to go around in the Eel, and a lot of it is accumulating behind the dam. There are only two ways that water can be released from Scottdam. One is over the top when the reservoir is completely full, and the other is through a needle valve, which is a low-level outlet at the base of the dam. And this needle valve is extremely vulnerable to becoming clogged, which would render it useless. Further concerning is that PG&E has acknowledged that they have no plan in place to repair the valve in the event of a failure. That's not to say it couldn't be repaired, but they don't have a plan laid out and ready to put into action. So in the event of a needle valve failure, water releases from the dam would be immediately halted. And that includes, not just releases to the diversion farther downstream, but any water traveling down the main stem Eel River. It's a pretty concerning thing. And then, as I mentioned before, the recent failure of the main transformer bank at the powerhouse, it just really underscores the unreliability of this aging structure. The project is generating no electricity, and then it's really limited in how much water can be diverted to the Russian River for water users in Potter Valley and farther south because of this closure of the powerhouse. The project is also really expensive. And, if I were PG&E, this would probably be, given how much we know they care about public safety, probably what they're thinking about is actually the expense of running the project. PG&E has acknowledged that it costs roughly $30 for every dollar of electricity that's generated. But it's important to remember that this cost is actually paid for by ratepayers, not by the company. So just, always keep that in mind, that PG&E has many ways around responsibility. And the project also needs really costly upgrades to come into compliance with modern environmental laws. This project helps invasive species. The Sacramento pike minnow is an invasive species in the Eel River. They thrive in the warm, stagnant conditions in the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. They were actually first introduced into the reservoir in the 70s as bait fish. And since then, they've really proliferated throughout the entire watershed. They not only compete with native fish for habitat and resources, but they also predate on salmonids. And because they thrive in the ecosystem created by the dams, wildlife experts have acknowledged that dam removal is really the best thing we can do to address the growing population of pike minnow. Restoring access to the headwaters will also provide steelhead with refugia, which is inaccessible to the pike minnow. Because steelhead are such incredible athletes, they can jump over natural barriers that the pike minnow just can't handle. And speaking of which, actually, this is a photo here. I was out with some researchers several years ago who were measuring these roughs to determine if they were a barrier to anadromy. They ended up determining that it's a partial barrier. So when flows are lower than what you see here, it's unlikely that steelhead can clear the jump. But frankly, researchers have time and again been really shocked by the amazing athletic potential of steelhead. It's not an uncommon experience that folks are, measuring the falls and trying to figure it out. And then lo and behold, they look up above them and find some kind of evidence that steelhead have been there before. And then finally, I've already talked about how the lack of fish passage harms native species, but there is one other way that they harm native species that I want to talk about, which is the natural accumulation of methylated mercury in the reservoir. In a 2014 study, the fish with the highest recorded mercury levels in the entire state actually came from Lake Pillsbury. And I'll give one of my other disclaimers here. Apologies to any chemists in the audience. I'm going to really oversimplify this process. But essentially, mercury naturally methylates in anaerobic environments like reservoirs, which makes it biologically available. And then as creatures are eating each other, it bioaccumulates up the food web. And then ultimately, it presents real dangers to predators or to any human who might consume fish caught in the reservoir. So if you like to fish and you go to Lake Pillsbury, please don't eat what you catch. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory side of this issue. Hydropower projects are licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's FERC. So if you hear me saying FERC, it is not the four-letter word you're thinking of, but one of my favorite four-letter words. So FERC issues these licenses about every 50 years. So this means that for many hydro projects, modern environmental laws didn't exist during the last relicensing, and relicensing offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change or improve or remove projects. In 2017, PG&E began the process of relicensing this project, but they later decided to abandon the effort. They attempted to both sell and auction the project, neither of which were successful. They ultimately declared bankruptcy, which was mostly due to their mounting wildfire liability. And at this point, PG&E might have applied to surrender their license, but a group of diverse stakeholders who are now known as the Two Basin Partnership came together and submitted a notice of intent to take over the project on their own. This relicensing effort by the Two Basin Partners went on for a couple of years, but it now appears that it'll be unsuccessful. And that's partly because of factors out of their control, like funding. And in the coming months, probably by January at least, we'll know more about the timeline, but it's fairly certain that dam removal will now happen along the license surrender and decommissioning path through FERC rather than through relicensing. Really, for those of us on the Eel River side who are interested in just getting the dams out, it's kind of a different path to the same destination. So when PG&E began this process in 2017, Congressman Jared Huffman also began a parallel process. He convened an ad hoc stakeholder committee that began work to evaluate the potential for what he called a two-basin solution. This solution would meet both fish passage and water supply needs. And there were two technical working groups that did a ton of research evaluating our options. And all of that work was based on these two co-equal goals, as we call them. I'll let you read them here for yourself. Essentially, these goals just mean achieving volitional fish passage while avoiding adverse impacts to water supply. So over the years, working with the ad hoc committee, there was a lot of uncertainty about what constitutes volitional fish passage. One National Marine Fisheries Service employee referred to it as allowing the fish to go where they want, when they want, without human assistance. I really like that definition because it's clear and simple, and it's really important in processes like this with a lot of diverse stakeholders that we're all using agreed upon definitions for terms like that. So it's always been clear to groups like Friends of the Eel that dam removal is the best option for volitional fish passage, but that also became the clear winner after years of studies by the technical working group that was a part of this committee. We studied possible alternative scenarios for fish passage, like ladders, trap and haul, which is not actually volitional, side channels built around the dam. They even, not so seriously, I hope, looked at the fish cannon, which is just like it sounds. It's like a giant t-shirt cannon that would shoot the fish over the dam, also not volitional. Because of several factors, it turns out that any fish ladder at Scottdam would not be super effective and would also cost at least $90 million. So that was ruled out as not being viable because of the extreme expense. And then I just want to share this cool graphic that one of my friends made. It's a representation of the different options for the future of the project. So here we are currently, water comes down from the headwaters, passes through Scottdam, and then some of it is diverted through that crazy long tunnel, goes to the powerhouse, and then continues on to Lake Mendocino. And then, of course, water also continues down the Eel River side. Under the two-basin solution, the partners had proposed that Scottdam would be removed. They were uncertain about what would happen to Cape Horn Dam. It's possible that it would be removed and there would be some alternative mechanism for a damless diversion. But they were proposing to continue the diversion as a wet season only diversion, which would be a lot more ecologically appropriate. Uncertainty about the powerhouse. But this is, kind of what we were envisioning for the last couple of years. But now that that's not going to work out, we are looking at this possible scenario. And what's important to note here is that the FERC decommissioning process is unlikely to provide for a diversion without some kind of negotiated settlement from stakeholders. So at this point, those of us on the eel who really just want to see fish passage restored, like I said, it's still pretty much the same scenario. We're going to see the fish going up into the mountains and being happy fish. But for those who want to see a diversion continue to the Russian, it's really important for them to, put forth the resources to come up with that solution and start working on a negotiated settlement. So this is a nearly complete list of the participants in the ad hoc committee. I say nearly complete because I'm sure I am missing some folks, but I kind of focused on those who have been most active during the process over the last several years. And highlighted in yellow are, I have it labeled here as Planning Agreement Group. The two-basin partnership underwent a variety of different name changes. But these are the 5 entities that make up the the Two Basin Partnership. There's been a lot of discussion about some entities being excluded from the partnership, and it's not really necessary for me to get into now, but I do just want to emphasize that the Two Basin Partnership is separate from Congressman Huffman's ad hoc committee. And the ad hoc committee, as you can see from this list here, represents a really wide diversity of stakeholders. So let's talk about the water supply side for a bit. The out-of-basin diversion from the Eel to the Russian has been in place since Cape Horn Dam was built in 1908. Before then, Potter Valley was a dry farming community. But now, even in drought years, they enjoy a pretty abundant water for quite a low cost. And part of why the cost is so low is because the water is essentially considered as a waste byproduct from PG&E's electrical generation. So this community has grown up around this abundant water source over the past century. They've built a pretty unique agricultural economy. And it's important to know this because this is why it's politically untenable for someone like Congressman Huffman, who is a fierce fisheries advocate. I'm so happy to have him as our representative, but it's not really tenable for him to advocate dam removal without a continued diversion. And so this is why we started exploring options for that two-basin solution. So the diversion from the Eel to the Potter Valley project, to Potter Valley is about 65,000 acre feet. And years ago, this diversion was much larger, but the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a biological opinion that found the diversion was harming aquatic life in both watersheds. And so it was reduced. And after all this, we had some safeguards to ensure that salmon and steelhead had the necessary flows to migrate upstream. So this is why today, when we talk about the problems with the diversion, it's one of timing and not cumulative flows. And this is why continuing the diversion is not something that's totally objectionable to us, because it is possible to divert something like 65,000 acre feet from the Eel during the wet season and have it be pretty ecologically insignificant. We recently learned some pretty interesting facts about water use in Potter Valley, and I won't get too much into the details, but I think it's important to mention that one thing we learned from these recent studies is that there's a huge amount of water lost to inefficient use, about 4,000 acre feet. And for comparison, this is roughly equal to the amount of water used in Potter Valley for all permanent crops like grapes and pears, as well as their row crops. So, when it comes to finding solutions for that community, I think there's a variety of options, and I look forward to seeing all of those options explored. And then, like I said before, any water that's remaining after it's used in Potter Valley continues down the East Branch of the Russian River to Lake Mendocino Reservoir, where the Sonoma County Water Agency uses it to supply to its contractors. And it's kind of important to know too that Lake Mendocino is actually a flood control project. So it's managed by the Army Corps. And this just means that when water levels in the reservoir reach a certain threshold, they must be released downstream. But there is some really novel, really exciting management techniques being used there that are improving water use. So, like I mentioned, it does appear that the partners are going to be unsuccessful in their efforts to relicense the project. In September, it seems like just a couple weeks ago, but that was almost 2 months ago now, the partners had a requirement to submit a status report to FERC detailing their progress on completing studies and other components of the relicensing process. And because they have made very little progress, partially because PG&E has refused to negotiate with them or cover the cost of relicensing studies. So in lieu of a progress report, the partners submitted a request for an abeyance or a pause in their process until May of next year. FERC responded with a surprisingly reasonable denial of the abeyance, and they actually imposed a deadline to submit a progress report within 60 days. So that means in about a week, we'll see a submission to FERC by the partners. And we anticipate that it's probably just going to say that they have made very little progress. Absent some miraculous source of tens of millions of dollars in funding and a sudden embrace of rapid negotiations, we anticipate that the partners will be withdrawing their notice of intent to relicense the project. They should do this in November. That's really what we'd like to see so we can all move on, but that's unlikely. So we will just have to keep waiting until the partners formally withdraw their notice of intent so that we can begin the license surrender process. PG&E's made it pretty clear that they're willing and interested to surrender their license. So as soon as the partners withdraw their intent, we can get on with that process. It is really important to keep in mind, though, that pursuing license surrender is not necessarily going to be an easy solution. And license surrender does not necessarily mean project decommissioning and removal. So we do still have some work cut out for us. But for all the reasons I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, FERC would be legally vulnerable in a number of ways if they didn't order project removal. And you can bet that Friends of the Eel has already indicated to FERC that we are willing and ready to pursue litigation if they don't do what's right and mandate dam removal. It's really important to Friends of the Eel that we see these dams removed as quickly as possible. And a big part of the reason for that is the summer steelhead. This is, it's just so urgent that we provide access to the Eel River headwaters to give summer steelhead the real opportunity to thrive. So the eel is the southernmost run of what we call premature migrating fish. And that just means that these particular steelhead, the summer steelhead, don't migrate at the same time as their fall counterparts. Many of you probably know that steelhead and salmon typically start running up the rivers when the rains arrive in the winter and fall. But these guys have a really unique life history and enter the river much earlier. Summer steelhead, as well as spring chinook, enter the watershed in the spring and summer, and they hold in deep, cold pools before then traveling much farther up into the upper reaches of the watershed. So they really basically just have a head start on their fall and winter counterparts. They enter the water sexually immature and are just really really strong and vibrant fish. I'm sure if there's any anglers, in the audience there, they can speak to how exciting it is to encounter these fish in the wild. And as you can see on this map here, summer steelhead have been found in the upper reaches of the Van Dusen, the upper reaches of the Middle Fork, and this map's actually a little old because they've also been found in the upper reaches of the North Fork. And if it were not for Scottdam here, we would also be finding them in the upper reaches of the main stem, but we do find their genetics up there. We worked with some really excellent scientists from UC Davis to collect data and to petition to protect summer steelhead in the Eel River. One of those scientists I want to call out is Samantha Cannery. She lived on the Van Dusen and was inspired to learn more about summer steelhead after hearing stories from locals about them. And she just deserves a ton of credit for leading research on Northern California summer steelhead. She also has these awesome stories about trekking deep into the headwaters of the eel tributaries in search of these rare fish. If you know her, I'm sure you've probably heard about this from her. And I just want to say again, I'm going to kind of oversimplify the genetics here. So all you geneticists and fisheries biologists out there, please forgive me. So something really interesting that genetic research is starting to reveal is that the rainbow trout above Scottdam have the gene for anadromy, which is the trait for migrating from freshwater to saltwater and back again. But they also have the gene for premature migration, that is to say, the potential to be summer steelhead. And it's important to know here that rainbow trout and steelhead are nearly identical fish. Trout are essentially just freshwater versions of steelhead. This map shows data on fish found to have the gene for anadromy. So those which are solid resident trout are pictured in blue, and where they found fish that have at least one gene for anadromy is in black and yellow. And then this map shows fish found to have the gene for premature migration, and aka the potential to be summer steelhead. As you can see, there are several fish above the ruffs at Bloody Rock, and that was that photo I showed earlier where researchers were measuring the barrier to anadromy. Sam has some interesting theories as to why this is, and I'm going to totally butcher it and oversimplify it, but essentially this region is much easier for summer steelhead to access than winter steelhead. And so before Scottdam was here, the summer steelhead would travel way up the main stem, find a deep hole to hold in. And then when the rains came, they would make it up to this barrier and get over it while the flows were still high enough for them to pass that barrier. Any winter steelhead that are starting way back 160 miles downstream at the mouth of the river wouldn't probably have the flows that they need to get up there by the time they made it. So this genetic discovery is really exciting news, and it means that once we remove the dams and restore fish passage, there's potential for the progeny of the trout that are trapped back here behind Scottdam to start for their children, for the progeny to start their anadromous life history again and essentially become steelhead. And there's also a chance that some of these steelhead could give rise to a larger population of summer steelhead. It's really important to preserve as many diverse life histories as possible. This is key to giving species resilience against drastic shifts in their environment, like climate change, and it's really why the eel holds such potential. So what are we doing for the summer steelhead? Well, in 2018, Friends of the Eel submitted petitions to list summer steelhead with both the state and the feds. Last year, we received a denial to our petition from the feds, which was not exactly surprising. And this summer, though, our petition before the state was approved. And so Northern California summer steelhead are now listed as endangered under the state ESA. We're continuing to work with the scientists at UC Davis to develop additional research and evidence and continue to seek a listing with the feds. And it's really helpful that our attempts to list summer steelhead are nicely aligned with attempts by the Karuk tribe and others to list spring Chinook in the Klamath and farther north. Thanks to the really compelling evidence that we've gathered, as well as a recent state listing, we felt pretty hopeful about securing a listing at the federal level and getting additional recognition for these critically endangered fish. And speaking of critical problems on the eel, you have all probably heard by now about this absurd proposal to privatize and rebuild the Northwestern Pacific Railroad and use it to ship coal from the Powder River Basin up the Eel River Canyon for export out of Humboldt Bay. If you haven't, check out the excellent reporting in the Lost Coast Outpost from around the beginning of September. They did just a wonderful job of letting everybody know what's happening. So a little bit of background on how we got here. Friends of the Eel worked for over a decade to address environmental destruction and mismanagement of the former line under the North Coast Railroad Authority. Ultimately, we scored a pretty big win at the California Supreme Court, and this paved the way for Senator McGuire's legislation, which established the Great Redwood Trail. Part of working toward getting this trail in place is a legal process called rail banking, which essentially preserves the right-of-way and allows for alternative uses such as a trail. Unfortunately, rail banking also opens up the line to a process to something called offers of financial assistance. And this is basically the means by which another entity could take ownership of the line. We never expected anyone to take advantage of this opportunity because really the line is in such disrepair. Conservative estimates for rebuilding the line come in around $2.3 billion, but it's likely quite a bit more than that. And it ended up being a huge failure while it was running. In its heyday, maintenance costs on this line were the most expensive in the entire nation. Despite this, there are filings before the Surface Transportation Board, which is the independent federal entity that regulates freight transportation. There's filings before that board that indicate that there are at least 2 entities that are interested in submitting these offers of financial assistance. One is a secretive LLC based out of Wyoming, which the great investigative reporting from the Loco and Salt Lake Tribune revealed has connections to the coal industry. And the other entity is the skunk train down in Fort Bragg. I think there's lots of opportunities for puns about this just really stinking with the skunk train being involved. So why is this bad? I want to start off with the most important point that I think is really important for the community to grasp. Any train would be a coal train. I think there are a lot of people out there who think restoring rail to the region might be kind of cool. It could offer other benefits. Could maybe truck our garbage out of here, bring other commodities to the region for cheaper. And boy, wouldn't a passenger train be neat? But any train would be a coal train. This is because the high rebuilding and maintenance costs, any train would need to be financed by really high value, high volume freight. And coal is the only commodity that pencils out and makes the economic equation work. Any train could possibly carry other freight, but it would definitely need to carry coal to, like I said, make the economics work. And unfortunately, the line could never meet the safety standards necessary to carry passengers again. This is also bad because the Eel River Canyon is just, frankly, an unsuitable location for rail. It's geologically fragile, it's prone to constant landslides, and there's a lot of small but important tributaries which were demolished when the rail was originally built. And then there's the problem with coal dust. Coal dust has devastating impacts to public and environmental health. It contains particulate matter 2.5, which is associated with premature death, asthma, cardiac disease, prenatal complications, and it's been linked to an increased mortality in COVID-19. And importantly, for all of you trail advocates out there, if a private entity takes ownership of the line, we lose not only the future portions of the Great Redwood Trail, but existing segments along the right-of-way as well. This would likely mean the closure of the Humboldt Bay Trail North segment that the community worked so hard to get into place. And already the delays in rail banking are threatening funding for the Humboldt Bay South segment that is still in the works. So there's a lot of reasons to be quite concerned about this. What are we doing about it? Friends of the Eel, along with a number of other local organizations, have formed a new coalition called No Coal in Humboldt. You can check us out at nocoalhumboldt.org. We're working to mobilize local municipalities to do things like pass resolutions and ordinances, which we've already seen several of from Humboldt County, Arcata, Eureka, and a ton of other municipalities up and down the right-of-way. We're engaging with the Surface Transportation Board and the Department of Transportation to prevent takeover of the right-of-way. We are working with legal experts to prepare opposition to development of coal export facilities in the Bay, and we're organizing really strong political opposition. Luckily, we've got allies in the fight at the state and federal level. Senator McGuire and Congressman Huffman have both played a huge role in this. And it's also really important that we get involvement from lots and lots of community members. So you can visit nocoalhumboldt.org to learn more. You can read our fact sheets about the impacts of coal transportation, sign up for our email list to be notified of opportunities to act. And if you're part of an organization that wants to join as a member, please do get in touch with us. On that note, hopefully I've left some time for questions. And here is my contact information, and I welcome anyone to reach out to me.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia. We are all eager to jump in with questions. So I'm going to share some questions from the Zoom chat and the Facebook Live comments, and I will just keep checking. So if any new questions come in, I will read those. And I just want to say, as a reminder, the lecture is possible thanks to the sponsorship of Papa and Barkley, and our other conservation programs would not be possible without your help. So we will paste the link to donate to the Conservation Fund in the chat. And it's great that you mentioned Samantha Cannery's work, because we just funded a grant for her, a conservation grant this year for 2021 for her project, the ecology and distribution of summer run steelhead. So yes, we were very intrigued and excited about her project, and we're glad you got to touch on that. Okay, so we have many questions. Griffin says, that was awesome, learned a lot and feeling hopeful. Thanks for your work, FOER. I agree, that was a fantastic talk and I learned a lot as well. Richard Moss would like to know, what can individuals do to help get the dams removed?
You know, follow our work. If you're not signed up for our email list yet, you can do so at eelriver.org. We often provide opportunities for folks to write to FERC, you know, to challenge PG&E, but that the process is moving into FERC's license surrender process is both kind of promising, because it puts a lot of the responsibility back on PG&E for paying for it and, you know, getting the work done. But it does mean that it's a little bit less in the hands of all the stakeholders who are part of this process. So we're really going to have to make sure that we engage with FERC's process and possibly play a role in any kind of negotiated settlement agreement. So just be sure to follow our work, and we'll tell you about all the chances to get involved. And you know, particularly, I would recommend starting to familiarize yourself with FERC's process for public commenting. It can be a little bit complicated, but it is totally worth it to make your voice heard.
Thank you. He also, or they had also asked, how long do you think it will be before the dams are removed? This was kind of earlier in the talk, and is curious about getting the river back to its natural state.
Yeah, well, you know, I look a lot to the example of the Klamath. And once they had a plan in place, it sounds like they're on track to get those dams out by 2023. So I feel really hopeful that it could be just a couple-year process to go through the license surrender application and to develop a decommissioning plan with FERC. So, you know, being really hopeful about it, maybe we'll see those dams out in 6 or 7 years. But unfortunately, federal agencies are not necessarily known for their expedient processes. So this is one thing that we're really going to have to push the agency on and make sure that we are holding their feet to the fire to make swift decisions for the best interest of our fisheries.
Yeah. And Joshua asked, this was kind of before you talked about the different possible options, but had asked earlier, where and how does the allocation of water and the restoration of endangered salmonids within the Russian rivershed that rely on that diverted water, how does that kind of work into the equation?
Yeah, well, the Sonoma County Water Agency is responsible for ensuring that there are appropriate in-stream flows. And so that's kind of their bread and butter there. Some modeling that was done by the Water Supply Technical Working Group from the Ad Hoc Committee shows that they are definitely capable of meeting their water needs with a wet season only diversion. And so if that diversion can be established, that's a really great option. Another thing that many folks are looking into is Coyote Valley Dam, which is the dam that impounds Lake Mendocino, was actually built with the option to be raised and increase the capacity of that reservoir. So I think that's another thing that folks are looking into to be able to capture more winter flows there.
Great. And Sherman wants to know, how much do illegal marijuana grows affect all of this, and how much might things change and hopefully improve if that was no longer an issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think it's complicated because we know so little about the extent of a lot of illegal grows, particularly trespass grows, like up in the Mendocino National Forest. It's there's a really sad percentage, like something like 10%. And please don't quote me on that. I could be totally wrong, but it's a very low percentage of trespass grow operations that are identified that are actually remediated. So, I think we don't quite know the extent of the impact. There is a lot of cannabis growing that happens on the South Fork, which, one thing that I think some people in the area kind of misinterpret is that flows on the South Fork are not impacted by the dams because the headwaters of that tributary are separate from the main stem. So when we're talking about, decreased flows and hoping that dam removal might possibly change that, we're just mostly talking about the main stem of the river. And, it measuring, there's a saying from folks who like to advocate for river adjudication. It's something like, you can't manage what you don't measure. So because these, we're talking about illegal grow sites, they're not reporting their water use to anyone. So it's really difficult to know how much of an impact that is making. And I would say too, that in the Eel River, and I think probably in other watersheds as well, a little bit of water loss can be really significant because there's these, small little tributaries that are those cold water sources, particularly if they're coming direct from a spring. That can be a really, really critical source of cold water for salmonids. So even if it's just, a few acre feet that's being lost, that could actually be a pretty significant loss.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. We had a comment from Joshua, more than a question, but kind of in reference to talking about the coal train. I had said, just look up the train pesticide herbicide spill in the upper Sacramento River near Dunsmuir in Mount Shasta in the 90s and all the issues associated with that. So yeah, we've got folks in our community definitely aware that this could be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And another comment as well, such good information you shared with us. Thank you so much, from Michaela. Allison would like to know, says, thank you for the great talk, Alicia. What do you think is the probability of Cape Horn Dam being removed? And if it isn't removed, do you think the fish ladder will be improved?
Yes, I think definitely at least the fish ladder will be improved, and that's because the way that it is, the way that it's running right now is basically illegal. And we earlier this year we had a kind of obscure victory with FERC. They approved a new operation plan for a modification to the fish ladder, but they didn't consult with National Marine Fisheries Service like they were supposed to when they did that. And so Friends of the Eel sent in a letter, and we have been doing some background research on bringing a lawsuit against FERC for potential take at this site. And when we submitted our letter, FERC immediately halted and reversed course and said, oh, never mind, we're rescinding our authorization and we're going to go ahead and consult with NMFS. And they didn't acknowledge that it was the threat of litigation that made them do that, but I think it was pretty clear. So I think it's, a certainty that the fish ladder will at least be improved. And really, I think it's going to come down to feasibility, technical feasibility and economic feasibility. Improving the fish ladder could be way more expensive and result in not even very good fish passage than removing the dam and having new infrastructure that creates a damless diversion. So something like there's different kinds of well systems that can capture the water and transport it. There's been talk about putting in seasonal dams, like some of those rubber dams that are used in other watersheds. I'm actually not up to speed with the variety of options for alternative diversion structures, but there are quite a few options that have been explored, and I think it's pretty likely that Cape Horn Dam will come down as well.
Okay, thanks for that update. That's great. We have 2 more questions if you have time. We're a little bit over. Okay.
Yeah.
Grant is wondering, why would the feds not grant a listing when the state would?
It's a little bit complicated, and I would hate to provide inaccurate information, but essentially there is some internal disagreement at National Marine Fisheries Service about whether or not steelhead, or I mean, really summer steelhead and spring chinook, whether or not they meet the requirement to be considered a distinct population. And so because of this internal dispute at NMFS, they decided to deny the petition, and then the state approval actually came later. So I think, you know, if the state approval had come first, that might have been a little bit of a trigger for the feds to maybe go ahead and approve it. I'm not totally clear on how those, you know, political dynamics work between the 2 agencies. But we actually have new research and evidence that we are planning on using in either a fresh submission or either to litigate the denial of the previous submission. So stay tuned. Hopefully in the next few years, we will be able to secure a federal listing as well.
We hope so. And our last question is from Vivian. She wonders, how is dam removal physically accomplished? I know this is a huge question. And what happens to that sediment that you've been referencing? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So one model I always like to reference when we're talking about releasing sediment down a watershed is the Elwha Dam Removal, which I believe we just celebrated the 10th anniversary of that really huge dam removal project up in northern Washington state. And what they did there is they decided to, you know, after a good deal of research, I'm sure it wasn't a seat of the pants decision, but they decided to allow the sediment to just move through the watershed, and it ended up establishing a much larger estuary beach area, a really productive zone that was great for juvenile rearing, and ended up being a really wonderful asset to the watershed. In the eel, you know, watersheds are different, but I like to believe that we could see similar benefits to our estuary. One really promising thing that we learned thanks to some studies from about 2 years ago on the mercury in the reservoir is that it doesn't, it lives in organic matter. It's not living in the sediment. And so, you know, there was discussion about needing to plan for dredging the sediment and removing it from the reservoir and treating it like a toxic substance. But at this point, it actually seems that the best option to address the mercury accumulation is to go ahead and remove the conditions in which it is methylating and continuing to accumulate. I also have seen some preliminary studies about the different processes to remove the dam, and it looks like there's a rapid removal process, which is the favorite at the moment. So that means that it wouldn't be like a years long, like doing one notch and then doing another notch, but it would be a much more swift removal process. But I think a lot of that, is yet to be determined, particularly by studies that we hope to see from PG&E in the next few years.
Yeah. We have Tatiana wanted to know how they can access this recording later, and we will have it on our Sequoia Park Zoo Facebook page. We'll also have it available at sequoiaparkzoo.net and on our YouTube channel from there. But that will take a little bit of time to get up. So if you want to look at it immediately, it will be on our Facebook page. But yeah, I mean, we could go on. We have so many questions and great things coming in. We're so excited to have people so engaged in this topic and supportive of Friends of the Eel. The work that you all are doing is fantastic. I learned a lot at this talk. And we're just so appreciative you could come and talk to us tonight about all these important issues and let us know how we can get involved.
I'm really thankful for the opportunity. It's, like I said, it's really an honor to be working with this long established organization at such an important time for the watershed. And there's so many huge things that are going on right now that that I get to play a role in. It's awesome.
Absolutely. Well, good luck with all of these future projects. We hope we can have you back for an update and learn more about how everything is going. This is really important work, and thanks for being here tonight. And for everybody, thank you for coming. And I want to remind you that our next lecture in the series will be Wednesday, December 15th at 7 p.m. Lania Quinn Davidson is giving a talk entitled Burning from the Bottom Up, Restoring California's Fire Connection. And we will look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.